The autumn evening settled over the small town of Millbrook like a soft quilt being drawn across tired shoulders. The streetlights had just begun their gentle awakening, casting pools of amber warmth along the quiet sidewalks where fallen leaves gathered in small, rustling piles. The air carried that particular sweetness of October: wood smoke from distant chimneys, the faint suggestion of apples ripening in backyard orchards, and the cool promise of longer nights ahead. In a modest apartment above the old hardware store on Cedar Lane, a man named Marcus Holloway stood by his kitchen window, watching the day surrender to dusk. He was 43 years old, with broad shoulders that seemed built for carrying heavy things, not just physical weight, but the kind that settles in the heart after years of service and sacrifice. His forearms bore intricate tattoos that wound from wrist to elbow, military insignias softened by flowing designs, dates that marked losses he rarely spoke of, and a compass rose that pointed perpetually toward home. Marcus had been back in Millbrook for nearly 2 years now, though some days it felt like he had never truly arrived. The town of his childhood had changed in small ways: new storefronts where old ones had faded, different families living in houses he remembered from boyhood. But the rhythm of the place remained familiar, like a song he had known long ago and was slowly remembering. He turned from the window and moved through his small kitchen, where a kettle sat warming on the stove and a single plate waited on the counter. His movements were unhurried, careful, the motions of a man who had learned that peace was something you built moment by moment, breath by breath. The apartment was sparse but not empty: a worn leather armchair by the window, bookshelves lined with paperbacks and military histories, a small table where he took his meals, and photographs of friends and family arranged on a shelf near the door. Tonight, like most nights, Marcus prepared his simple dinner with quiet attention. He had learned to find comfort in these rituals: the chopping of vegetables, the stirring of soup, the way steam rose from the pot and softened the cool air of the room. Outside, the wind picked up gently, and the old building creaked in response, a sound that had become familiar and almost friendly over the months. Marcus thought about the job interview he had attended that morning, the fourth in as many weeks. He had worn his cleanest shirt, pressed his good pants, and arrived 15 minutes early with his resume printed on fresh paper. The position was for a facilities maintenance coordinator at a large estate on the north side of town, a grand old property called Winding Brook Manor that had been in the same family for generations. The work would suit his skills perfectly: overseeing repairs, managing the grounds, coordinating with contractors, keeping the beautiful old house running smoothly. But as he sat down across from the woman conducting the interview, Marcus had felt the familiar shift in the atmosphere, the way her eyes had traveled to his hands, his arms, the tattoos that crept up from beneath his rolled sleeves. Her name was Catherine Ashworth, and she was perhaps 50, dressed in elegant wool and pearls, her silver hair swept back in a precise arrangement. She owned Winding Brook Manor and had managed the family's various business interests since her husband's passing 3 years prior. The interview had been brief. Catherine's questions were perfunctory, her attention elsewhere, and Marcus had sensed early that the decision had already been made. When she finally spoke about not being quite the right fit, and considering other candidates, her voice carried that particular distance that he had encountered before: polite but final, dismissive in its courtesy. He didn't argue. He never did. He simply thanked her for her time, gathered his folder, and walked out through the beautiful foyer with its sweeping staircase and crystal chandelier, past the portraits of Ashworth ancestors looking down from gilded frames, and into the October sunshine that felt suddenly cold despite its brightness. Now, standing in his kitchen as night settled over Millbrook, Marcus let the memory drift away like smoke. He had learned not to hold too tightly to disappointments. There would be other opportunities. There always were. And in the meantime, he had his small apartment, his books, his morning walks through the town, and the gentle routine he had built for himself, one quiet day at a time. The soup was ready. He ladled it into a bowl, tore a piece of bread from the loaf on the counter, and carried his dinner to the small table by the window. Outside, the street was empty now, the shops closed, the last of the daylight fading to a deep blue that would soon become true darkness. A few stars were beginning to appear, faint and patient, waiting for the sky to darken enough to show their full brightness. Marcus ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, watching the night arrive. He thought about the next day, which would bring its own rhythm: a morning run, perhaps, then a stop at the library to check the job listings, followed by an afternoon helping old Mr. Brennan next door with his gutters. Small things, but good things. Enough to fill the hours and keep the shadows at bay. He was just finishing his meal when his phone buzzed with a text from his sister, Denise, who lived 2 towns over with her husband and 3 children. She was checking in, as she did most evenings, making sure he was eating and sleeping, managing. He typed back a brief response. All good here. Soup night. Talk tomorrow. And smiled at her reply, a string of heart emojis that made him shake his head with affection. The evening stretched ahead of him, quiet and undemanding. Marcus washed his dishes, dried them carefully, and put them away. He made a cup of tea and settled into his armchair with a book he had been reading slowly over the past week, a novel about a lighthouse keeper in Maine, full of storms and solitude and eventual peace. The words flowed gently, carrying him along like a slow current, and he let himself drift into the story as the night deepened outside his window. Around 10 o'clock, he marked his place and set the book aside. The apartment was warm now, the radiator ticking softly, and he felt the familiar pull of sleep beginning to settle over him. He moved through his nighttime routine with the same unhurried care he brought to everything, brushing his teeth, changing into comfortable clothes, checking the locks on the door, turning off the lights one by one until only the small lamp by his bed remained. He lay down and closed his eyes, listening to the quiet sounds of the old building settling around him. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For now, there was only this moment, the soft sheets, the gentle darkness, the peace of a day completed and released. And somewhere across town, in the grand house called Winding Brook Manor, Catherine Ashworth was just beginning an evening that would change everything she thought she knew about judgment, kindness, and the unexpected places where grace could be found. Catherine Ashworth had spent the day as she spent most days, attending to the countless details that came with managing a large estate and the family business interests that had been placed in her care. There had been phone calls with the family's financial advisors, a meeting with the landscaping company about preparing the grounds for winter, and a lengthy discussion with the insurance adjusters about damage to one of the outbuildings from a recent storm. By evening, she was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. It was the weariness of constant responsibility, of being the one everyone looked to for decisions, of carrying a burden that sometimes felt too heavy for any single person to bear. Her husband, Gerald, had made it look effortless, the way he managed the estate, the businesses, the family obligations, but Catherine knew now that it had not been effortless at all. He had simply been very good at not letting the strain show. She missed him terribly, even now, 3 years after his heart had simply stopped one spring morning while he was reading the newspaper in his study. The doctor said it had been quick, painless, that he likely never knew what was happening, small comfort that. She still found herself turning to speak to him sometimes, still reached for his hand in the night, still expected to hear his footsteps in the hallway when evening came. But life continued, as it always did, and Catherine had learned to fill the empty spaces with work, with duty, with the 1,000 small tasks that kept her moving forward day after day. The estate was her responsibility now, and she took that responsibility seriously, perhaps too seriously, her daughter sometimes suggested. Elizabeth had inherited her father's easy manner, his ability to take things in stride, and she worried about her mother's tendency to carry everything alone. Tonight, however, Catherine had allowed herself a small indulgence. An old friend from college, Margaret, was visiting from Boston and staying at a bed and breakfast in a village about 40 minutes north of Millbrook. They had arranged to meet for dinner at a restaurant halfway between, a quiet place with good food and a fireplace where they could sit and talk without interruption. It had been a lovely evening. Margaret was warm and witty, full of stories about her grandchildren and her recent trip to Portugal, and for a few hours, Catherine had felt like a younger version of herself. The woman she had been before widowhood and responsibility had shaped her into someone more guarded, more careful, more alone. By the time they said goodbye in the parking lot, trading promises to visit again soon, it was nearly 11 o'clock. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant overhead, and Catherine pulled her coat tighter as she walked to her car, a sleek sedan that Gerald had bought for her just months before his death, still reliable after all these years. She started the engine and pulled onto the quiet highway, the headlights cutting a path through the darkness. The road wound through farmland and forest, past sleeping houses and silent fields, and Catherine felt the pleasant drowsiness of a good evening settling over her. The heater hummed softly, the radio played something classical and soothing, and she let her thoughts drift to nothing in particular as the miles passed. It happened without warning, somewhere between one moment and the next. A strange sound from the engine, a mechanical cough, a shudder, and then the dashboard lit up with warning lights, the car losing power so quickly that Catherine barely had time to guide it to the shoulder before it died completely. She sat in the sudden silence, her heart beating quickly, her hand still gripping the steering wheel. Outside, the darkness pressed against the windows, vast and complete. There were no streetlights on this stretch of road, no houses visible, no other cars in sight. Just the night, the cold, and the absolute stillness of a world that had suddenly become very small. Catherine tried the ignition. Nothing. She tried again, pumping the gas pedal, turning the key with increasing desperation. The engine made a weak sound, almost apologetic, and then fell silent again. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly, and found what she had feared. No signal. The road must be in a dead zone, one of those pockets in the hills where cell service simply didn't reach. She held the phone up, moved it around the car, even opened the door and stepped into the cold air. But the screen stubbornly refused to show any bars. The temperature was dropping. Catherine could see her. Breath now, small clouds that dissipated quickly in the darkness. She was dressed for a dinner out, not for standing on the side of a highway at midnight. Her elegant coat was warm enough for walking from car to restaurant, but not for waiting indefinitely in the cold. She looked up and down the road, hoping for headlights, for any sign of another vehicle. Nothing. The highway stretched empty in both directions, a dark ribbon disappearing into the night. She thought about walking. There must be a house somewhere, a gas station, something, but the darkness was so complete that she couldn't see more than a few feet beyond her car, and she had no idea how far the nearest help might be. For the first time in a long time, Catherine Ashworth felt truly afraid. Not the small fears of daily life, worry about finances, concern about the estate, anxiety about her daughter's happiness, but real, physical fear. She was alone, stranded, unable to call for help, and the night was growing colder by the minute. She got back in the car and locked the doors, huddling in the driver's seat with her coat pulled tight around her. The sedan still had some warmth trapped inside, but it was fading quickly, and she knew that by morning, if she had to wait that long, she would be dangerously cold. Minutes passed. Perhaps 10, perhaps 20. She lost track. She kept checking her phone, hoping for even a flicker of signal, but the screen remained stubbornly empty. She thought about Gerald, about how he would have handled this with his usual calm competence. He would have known what to do. He always had. And then, just as the cold was beginning to seep through her clothing and into her bones, she saw them. Headlights, distant but approaching, the first sign of life she had seen since the car died. Catherine got out of the sedan and stood by the side of the road, waving her arms as the lights grew closer. The vehicle slowed, pulled to a stop behind her car, and she felt a wave of relief so powerful that it nearly brought tears to her eyes. But as the driver's door opened and a figure emerged, silhouetted against the headlights, Catherine felt her relief falter. The man walking toward her was tall, broad-shouldered, and she could see something dark crawling up his forearms. Tattoos, intricate and extensive, visible even in the dim light. She took an involuntary step back, her hand going to her phone as if it could somehow help her now. The man stopped a respectful distance away, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Evening, ma'am," he said, and his voice was quiet, gentle, carrying none of the threat her imagination had supplied. "Looks like you're having some trouble. Can I help?" Catherine stared at him, recognition dawning slowly through her fear. She knew this man. She had sat across from him just that morning, looking at his resume without really seeing it, making a decision based on nothing more than the markings on his skin. Marcus Holloway stood in the cold October night, waiting patiently for her to answer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The night wrapped around them like a held breath. The only sounds, the soft idling of Marcus's truck and the distant whisper of wind through the trees. Catherine felt the cold pressing against her, felt the embarrassment rising in her chest, felt a dozen conflicting emotions tangling together until she couldn't separate one from another. Marcus seemed to recognize her as well, though his expression remained calm, neutral, giving nothing away. He lowered his hand slowly and gestured toward her car. "Engine trouble?" he asked, his voice carrying that same gentle quality she had noticed that morning, though she hadn't really listened to it then. I've got some tools in my truck. Might be able to help. Catherine found her voice, though it came out smaller than she would have liked. It just stopped. The lights came on, and then everything went dead. Marcus nodded, as if this was a perfectly ordinary problem with a perfectly ordinary solution. Mind if I take a look? She stepped aside, and he moved past her toward the sedan, his movements unhurried and careful. He opened the driver's door and reached inside to pop the hood, then walked to the front of the car and lifted it. The interior light of her car provided just enough illumination for him to see, and he leaned in, studying the engine with the focused attention of someone who understood machines. Catherine watched him work, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She should say something, she knew. Thank him, at least. Apologize, perhaps. But the words seemed stuck somewhere in her throat, tangled up with pride and shame and the uncomfortable awareness that this man she had dismissed so quickly was now the only person standing between her and a very long, very cold night. Looks like your alternator belt, Marcus said after a few minutes, straightening up and wiping his hands on a rag he had pulled from his pocket. It snapped. That's why you lost power so fast. Battery couldn't keep up without the alternator charging it. Can you fix it? He shook his head slowly, but there was no judgment in the gesture. Not out here, not at night. It's a tow job, but I can give you a ride into town, get you somewhere warm, and we can call a service in the morning. Catherine hesitated. Everything she had been taught, every instinct bred by years of caution, told her not to get into a vehicle with a stranger on a dark highway. But this wasn't quite a stranger, was he? She knew his name, had seen his resume, had sat across from him in the bright safety of her own home just hours before. And more than that, more than any of the practical considerations, there was something in his manner that spoke of trustworthiness. A steadiness, a patience, a fundamental decency that she had been too distracted to notice that morning. She saw it now, clearly, and felt something shift inside her, a small crack in the walls she had built so carefully over the past 3 years. That's very kind of you, she said finally. I would appreciate the ride. Marcus nodded and walked back to his truck, returning a moment later with a heavy blanket that he handed to her without ceremony. You'll want this. The heater's good, but it takes a few minutes to warm up. Catherine took the blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders, following him to the passenger side of his truck. He opened the door for her, waited until she was settled, then closed it gently and walked around to the driver's side. Within moments, they were moving, the truck's headlights illuminating the empty highway as it curved toward Millbrook. For the first few miles, neither of them spoke. The truck's heater began to push warm air into the cabin, and Catherine felt herself slowly thawing, the tension in her shoulders easing as the cold released its grip. The blanket smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something clean and simple, and she found herself relaxing into it without meaning to. It was Marcus who broke the silence, his voice low and conversational, asking nothing and expecting nothing. Storm's supposed to come through tomorrow, first real cold front of the season. Good night to be inside. Catherine nodded, though he wasn't looking at her. Yes, I imagine so. More silence, but easier now. The road unwound before them, familiar landmarks beginning to appear. The old covered bridge, the turn-off for Peterson's orchard, the gentle rise where the highway crested before descending into the valley where Millbrook slept. I should apologize, Catherine said suddenly, the words surprising her almost as much as they seemed to surprise him. For this morning, I didn't give you a fair chance. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his hand steady on the wheel. When he spoke, there was no bitterness in his voice, no accusation, only a kind of gentle acceptance that made Catherine's shame deepen. Nothing to apologize for, ma'am. Everyone's got their reasons for the decisions they make. I don't hold it against you. But she did. She held it against herself, and she saw now, with painful clarity, how quick she had been to judge, how easily she had dismissed a person based on nothing more than the surface of his skin. Where did you serve? She asked, because it seemed important to know something real about him, something beyond the assumptions she had made. Army, 12 years. 3 tours overseas. He paused, and she could hear something in the pause. Memories, perhaps, or the careful consideration of how much to share. Came back about 2 years ago. Been finding my way since then. Catherine thought about what that must be like, leaving behind one life and trying to build another in a world that didn't always make room for people who had given so much. She thought about Gerald, who had served briefly in his youth and spoken of it rarely, carrying his own quiet burdens that she had only glimpsed. "The position at the estate," she said slowly. "It's still open, if you're still interested." Marcus glanced at her briefly, then returned his eyes to the road. "That's kind of you to offer, but you don't owe me anything. I'd rather earn it fair if it's all the same to you." There was no reproach in his words, but Catherine felt them like a gentle correction. She had offered from guilt, and he had recognized it instantly. Recognized it, and, with a grace she didn't deserve, declined. "Then let me say this differently," she said, sitting up a little straighter, the blanket falling from her shoulders. "I made a mistake this morning. I looked at you and saw something that made me uncomfortable, and I let that discomfort make my decision for me. I didn't look at your resume properly. I didn't ask the right questions. I didn't see you at all." She took a breath. "I would like the chance to correct that mistake. Not because you helped me tonight, but because I should have done it right the first time." The truck rolled through the sleeping streets of Millbrook, past the darkened storefronts and quiet houses, toward the center of town where a few lights still burned. Marcus was silent for a long moment, and Catherine waited, giving him the time she hadn't given him that morning. "I appreciate that," he said finally. "And yes, ma'am? I'm still interested in the position?" Catherine felt something ease in her chest. Not absolution, exactly, but the beginning of it. The first step on a road that would be longer than tonight's drive, but worth walking. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm, like the slow turning of pages in a story that was only beginning to reveal its deeper patterns. Marcus began work at Winding Brook Manor on a Monday morning in late October, arriving just as the sun was painting the grounds in shades of gold and amber. The estate was beautiful in a way that spoke of generations of care. Old trees standing sentinel along the drive, gardens that had been tended for decades, and the house itself rising gracefully against the autumn sky, its stone walls warm in the morning light. He started with small things, as he had learned to do in all aspects of life. The gutters needed cleaning before winter. Several windows had developed drafts that could be sealed with patience and the right materials. The old greenhouse behind the main garden had fallen into disuse, its glass panels clouded and its door hanging slightly off its hinges. Nothing that couldn't be repaired with time and attention. Catherine watched him work from a distance at first, observing through windows or during brief encounters in the hallways. She was not accustomed to revising her judgments, and the process felt uncomfortable, like wearing a coat that didn't quite fit. But with each passing day, each quiet interaction, each small evidence of his competence and care, she found the discomfort fading, replaced by something closer to respect. Marcus, for his part, went about his work with the same gentle steadiness that characterized everything he did. He learned the rhythms of the estate, when the mail arrived, when the landscaping crew came, when Catherine took her afternoon tea in the library. He introduced himself to the other staff with quiet courtesy. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper who had worked for the Ashworth family for 30 years. Daniel, the young man who helped with the grounds. Maria, who came twice a week to help with the heavy cleaning. They were uncertain of him at first, this tattooed stranger who had appeared so suddenly in their midst. But uncertainty gave way to acceptance as they saw how he worked, how he listened, how he treated the old house with the same respect he showed the people within it. Mrs. Patterson, in particular, began to warm to him after he fixed the sticky drawer in the kitchen that had been annoying her for months, and Maria declared him a good soul after he carried heavy boxes for her without being asked. The October days grew shorter, the nights longer and colder. The storm that had been predicted came and went, leaving the grounds blanketed in the first frost of the season. Marcus rose early each morning, made his simple breakfast, and walked to the estate through air that smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. He found peace in the work, in the physicality of it, in the satisfaction of seeing problems solved and order restored. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he and Catherine began to talk. It started with practical matters, which repairs to prioritize, what supplies were needed, how the estate had been maintained in years past. But practical conversations have a way of expanding, given enough time, and soon they were speaking of other things: the town, the season, the books they were reading, the small observations that accumulate in the quiet spaces of daily life. Catherine told him about Gerald, about the years they had shared in this house, about the sudden loss that had reshaped everything. Her voice was soft when she spoke of him, carrying the particular tenderness of grief that has aged into something bearable but never quite absent. Marcus listened without interrupting, without offering easy comfort, simply present in the way that sometimes means more than words. In turn, he spoke of his own life, carefully, in pieces, as if testing how much weight the conversation could bear. He told her about growing up in Millbrook, about the grandmother who had raised him after his parents' early deaths, about the day he had walked into the recruiting office at 18, looking for purpose and direction. He spoke of the friends he had made in the army, the ones who had survived and the ones who had not, and the strange journey of coming home to a place that was familiar and foreign all at once. They talked in the library sometimes when the day's work was done, and the evening was settling soft and blue over the estate. They talked in the kitchen, where Mrs. Patterson would pretend not to be listening while she prepared dinner. They talked on the grounds, walking slowly between the garden beds where perennials were going dormant and the last brave marigolds were holding on against the cold. One afternoon in early November, Catherine found Marcus in the greenhouse, working on the frame of the old door. Sunlight streamed through the clouded glass, making patterns on the stone floor, and she stood for a moment watching him before he noticed her. "It's looking better," she said when he turned. "I haven't been in here for years. Gerald used to love this space." Marcus set down his tools and wiped his hands on his work cloth. "The structure's solid, just needs some attention. Most things do, given time." Catherine walked slowly through the greenhouse, touching the edges of old wooden benches, looking at the spaces where plants had once grown. "He used to start his tomatoes in here every spring, said the ones from the nursery never tasted right. He wanted to grow them from the beginning, to know their whole story." She turned to face Marcus, and he saw something in her expression that he had glimpsed before, a softening, a vulnerability she kept carefully hidden beneath her composed exterior. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about that night on the highway, about what might have happened if you hadn't come along." "Someone would have," Marcus said simply. "You wouldn't have been out there forever." "Perhaps. But it was you. You specifically after I had treated you so poorly that morning." She shook her head, a small, rueful movement. "I've wondered since then if there was something more to it. Some meaning, some purpose." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. "I don't know about meaning," he said finally, "but I know that things happen the way they happen, and sometimes the best we can do is pay attention and try to learn something from it." Catherine nodded slowly, and the afternoon light caught the silver in her hair, making it shine like something precious. "That's very wise." "Not wise," he said, with the first hint of a smile she had seen from him. "Just lived. There's a difference." The weeks passed, and Marcus's presence at the estate became as natural as the changing of the seasons. November deepened into its quiet heart, the days growing shorter, the world turning inward toward the warmth of hearth and home. The greenhouse was restored to its former glory, its glass cleaned and gleaming, its door rehung and swinging true. Catherine began to speak of planting again in spring, of starting tomatoes the way Gerald used to, and there was hope in her voice where before there had been only memory. The other staff had fully accepted Marcus by now, treating him as one of their own. Mrs. Patterson saved him the best biscuits from her afternoon baking. Daniel sought his, advice on everything from car trouble to matters of the heart. Maria brought him homemade tamales on the days she worked, insisting he was too thin and needed feeding. And Catherine had changed in ways that even she didn't fully recognize. The walls she had built so carefully over the past 3 years had developed cracks, letting in light that she had thought was gone forever. She laughed more easily now, worried less about appearances, found herself looking forward to the conversations she and Marcus shared in the quiet spaces of the day. One evening in late November, just as the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, Marcus knocked on the library door. Catherine looked up from her reading, setting aside her glasses and closing her book. "Come in," she called, and he entered carrying something in his hands. A small wooden box, simple but beautifully made, the grain polished to a soft sheen. "I found this in one of the outbuildings," he said, setting it on the table beside her chair. "It was hidden behind some old equipment, covered in dust. I cleaned it up and thought you might want to see it." Catherine lifted the lid and caught her breath. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, were letters, dozens of them tied in bundles with ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to a pale silver. She recognized the handwriting at once, though she hadn't seen it in years. "These are Gerald's," she said softly, lifting one bundle with trembling fingers. "From before we were married. I never knew he kept them." She opened one carefully, unfolding paper that crackled with age, and began to read. Her eyes moved across the page, and Marcus watched as tears gathered slowly and spilled down her cheeks. Not tears of grief, but of something richer, more complex. Joy and sorrow woven together, the way they always are when we touch the past. "He wrote to me every day during our engagement," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I had lost these. I thought they were gone forever." She looked up at Marcus, and there was wonder in her face, gratitude that went beyond words. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for finding them." Marcus nodded, and in that moment something passed between them, an understanding that didn't need to be spoken. He had given her back a piece of her husband, a piece of her own history that she had thought lost, and in doing so, he had become something more than an employee, more than the stranger she had almost turned away on a cold October night. He had become a friend. The Christmas season arrived softly, carried on the cold winds of December and the first light snowfall that dusted the grounds of Winding Brook Manor like powdered sugar on a cake. The old house came alive with warmth and celebration as it had every year for generations. Garlands on the banisters, a towering tree in the main hall, candles glowing in every window. Catherine's daughter, Elizabeth, came home from the city for the holidays, bringing her husband, Thomas, and their 2 young children, Sophie and James. The house filled with laughter and running footsteps, the delighted cries of children discovering presents, and the comfortable conversations of adults gathered around the fire. Elizabeth noticed the change in her mother immediately. There was a lightness in Catherine's step that hadn't been there in years, a warmth in her voice that reminded Elizabeth of happier times. And she noticed, too, the quiet man with the tattooed arms who moved through the house with gentle competence, fixing a loose ornament here, adjusting a crooked wreath there, always present but never intrusive. "Mother," Elizabeth said on Christmas Eve, as they sat together in the library while the rest of the family dozed by the fire. "Who is he? The man working here?" Catherine smiled, a soft expression that held depths Elizabeth couldn't quite read. "His name is Marcus Holloway. He's the facilities coordinator I hired a few months ago." "He seems like more than that." "He is," Catherine admitted. "He's become a friend, a good friend. He's taught me things about myself that I didn't know I needed to learn." Elizabeth studied her mother's face, seeing there a peace she hadn't witnessed since before her father's death. "I'm glad," she said simply. "You deserve to be happy, Mother. Dad would want that for you." Catherine reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the candles burned low and the Christmas snow continued to fall outside the window. On Christmas morning, the family gathered to open presents, the children shrieking with delight over each unwrapped treasure. Marcus had been invited to join them, Catherine's insistence over his polite protests, and he sat in an armchair near the tree, watching the celebration with a small smile that spoke of contentment. When the flurry of unwrapping had settled, Catherine retrieved a final gift from beneath the tree. It was wrapped simply in brown paper and tied with twine, and she carried it to Marcus with a slight tremor in her hands. "This is for you," she said. "A thank you and an apology, and a promise, all wrapped together." Marcus opened the package slowly, carefully, as if the wrapping itself were precious. Inside was a framed photograph, an old one from the estate's archives, showing the original greenhouse as it had been when it was first built, nearly a century ago. Beside it was a handwritten letter from Catherine, expressing her gratitude for everything he had done, her regret for how she had first treated him, and her hope that he would stay on at the estate for years to come. But there was something else beneath the letter, a set of keys on a simple ring. "There's a cottage at the edge of the property," Catherine explained, her voice soft. "It's been empty for years, but I've had it cleaned and restored. If you'd like it, it's yours. A proper home, not just an apartment above the hardware store. You've more than earned it." Marcus held the keys in his palm, their weight somehow greater than the metal could account for. He looked at Catherine, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed. "Say yes," Elizabeth called from across the room, smiling. "She's been planning this for weeks." Marcus looked around at the gathered family, at Elizabeth and Thomas, at little Sophie and James, at Mrs. Patterson hovering in the doorway with tears in her eyes, and felt something crack open in his chest. For so long, he had been alone, moving through the world with walls of his own, expecting nothing and asking for less. And now, here, in this house full of warmth and light, and people who had somehow become his people, he was being offered something he had almost forgotten how to want: a home, a place to belong. "Yes," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Thank you. Yes." Spring arrived at Winding Brook Manor the way spring always arrives. Gradually, then all at once, a slow awakening that suddenly bursts into full bloom. The gardens came alive with color, the old trees leafed out in fresh green, and the greenhouse stood restored and humming with new growth, its glass sparkling in the sunlight. Marcus had moved into the cottage on New Year's Day, carrying his few possessions through the cold January air and arranging them in rooms that already felt like home. In the months since, he had made the space his own, books on the shelves, photographs on the walls, the leather armchair from his old apartment positioned by the window where he could watch the sun rise over the estate. His relationship with Catherine had deepened into something precious and rare, not romantic, though some in town speculated about it, but something perhaps even more valuable. They were friends in the truest sense, two people who had found in each other a mirror that reflected their better selves. They walked the grounds together in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing, sharing silences that were comfortable and full. The day the greenhouse tomatoes produced their first fruit, Catherine brought Marcus to see them, her face alight with joy. "Gerald would have loved this," she said, cupping a small green tomato in her palm. "He always said the first one was the most important, even though it's too early to eat." "It's a promise," Marcus said, understanding without being told. "A promise of what's coming." Catherine nodded, and for a moment she was somewhere else, somewhere in the past, holding Gerald's hand in this very space. Then she returned, her eyes focusing on Marcus with a warmth that had become familiar. "You've changed my life, you know," she said quietly. "That night on the highway, if things had been different—" "They weren't," Marcus said gently. "They were exactly what they were." "I know." She smiled, setting down the tomato and brushing her hands on her apron. "But I still like to think about it sometimes. How close I came to missing all of this. How easily I could have let my fear and my prejudice rob me of something so good." "We all have those moments," Marcus said. "The ones where we could have gone one way or another. What matters is what we do with the chance we're given." They stood together in the greenhouse as the afternoon light softened toward evening, two people who had found each other across the distance of their differences and built a bridge strong enough to hold them both. A year had passed since that October night on the highway, and Millbrook was settling into another autumn, the trees blazing with color and the air carrying the familiar sweetness of the season. Marcus walked through town on a Saturday morning, nodding at neighbors who called his name, stopping to chat with shopkeepers who had come to know him, feeling the particular satisfaction of being recognized and welcomed. He had become part of the fabric of the community in ways he hadn't expected. He helped coach the youth soccer team on weekend mornings. He served on the committee that organized the town's annual fall festival. He had dinner with his sister and her family every Sunday, watching his nieces and nephew grow, slowly becoming the uncle they could count on. And he continued his work at the estate, which had become not just a job, but a vocation. The grounds had never looked better. The old house hummed with life and maintenance, and the greenhouse produced vegetables and flowers that Catherine shared with neighbors and friends. On this particular Saturday, Marcus was walking to the hardware store when he passed a young woman struggling with a flat tire on the side of the street. She was perhaps 25, tattooed and pierced, her hair a shade of blue that startled in the morning light. Her frustration was visible as she kicked the offending tire and looked around helplessly. Marcus crossed the street and approached her slowly, hands visible, voice gentle. "Need some help?" he asked. She looked at him, at the tattoos on his forearms, the steady calm in his eyes, and something in her expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit. "I don't know how to change it," she admitted. "I never learned." "That's okay," Marcus said, kneeling by the tire and beginning to work. "It's one of those things most people never learn until they need to. Let me show you." He worked slowly, explaining each step, letting her help when she was ready. By the time the spare was on and the old tire stowed, she was smiling, the frustration replaced by something warmer. "Thank you," she said. "Really, I was starting to freak out." "No need," Marcus said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "We all need help sometimes. The trick is learning to accept it when it comes." She nodded, and he saw her eyes travel to his tattoos, not with fear or judgment, but with curiosity. "Army?" she asked. 12 years. My brother was in the Marines. He came back different. He doesn't let anyone help him with anything." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. "It takes time," he said finally. "Coming back, finding your place again. Tell your brother that it gets easier. It doesn't get easy, but it gets easier." She nodded, and there were tears in her eyes now, though she was still smiling. "I'll tell him." They parted ways, and Marcus continued toward the hardware store, thinking about all the chance encounters that had led him here, the application for a job that had seemed hopeless, the woman who had refused to hire him, the night on the highway that had changed everything. He thought about Catherine, who had become family in all the ways that mattered, and about the estate that had become home. He thought about the years of service that had marked him, inside and out, and the slow healing that continued still, day by day, breath by breath. And he thought about the young woman with the blue hair, and her brother who had come back different, and all the people in all the world who were struggling to find their way home. The morning was beautiful, the autumn air sweet and cool, and Marcus Holloway walked through his town with a grateful heart, knowing that the journey was far from over, but glad. So glad for every step that had brought him here. The evening descended over Winding Brook Manor like a gentle hand drawing a curtain across the sky. The stars began their slow emergence, and the air cooled into that particular sweetness that only October can bring. In the main house, lamps glowed warm in every window, and the faint sound of music drifted from the library where Catherine was playing an old recording of Debussy that Gerald had loved. Marcus sat on the porch of his cottage, a cup of tea warming his hands, watching the last light fade from the horizon. The day's work was done, the season's preparations well underway, and there was nothing to do now but rest and be present with the gift of this quiet moment. He thought about the woman he had met that morning, the one with the blue hair and the worried eyes. He thought about her brother, somewhere out there, struggling with wounds that no one else could see. And he thought about his own journey, the long road from soldier to civilian, from lost to found, from isolation to belonging. It had not been easy. There had been dark nights and difficult days, moments when the path forward seemed impossible to find. But here he was, alive and whole, surrounded by people who cared about him, doing work that mattered in a place that felt like home. The music from the main house shifted to something slower, softer, a piece he didn't recognize, but that seemed to match the rhythm of his thoughts. He closed his eyes and let it wash over him, let the beauty of the evening settle into his bones. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to do good in a world that needed all the gentleness it could get. But tonight was for rest, for reflection, for the quiet gratitude that had become his constant companion. He thought about Catherine, about the unlikely friendship that had grown between them, about the way she had changed and the ways he had changed alongside her. She had taught him that it was possible to be seen, truly seen, by another person, and that being seen was not the same as being judged. And he had taught her, he hoped, that the surface of a person tells only the smallest part of their story, and that the real treasure lies always beneath. The night deepened around him, the stars growing brighter, the world growing quieter. Marcus finished his tea and set the cup aside, then rose and walked slowly back to his cottage, the soft grass whispering beneath his feet. Inside, he moved through his evening routine with the same unhurried care he brought to everything. He washed his cup, checked the doors, turned off the lights one by one. In the bedroom, he changed into comfortable clothes and pulled back the covers on the bed that had become his own. As he lay down and closed his eyes, he felt the peace of the evening settle over him like a blanket, soft and warm and complete. The cottage was quiet around him, the estate sleeping, the world at rest, and in the gentle darkness, surrounded by the life he had built from the pieces of the one he had lost, Marcus Holloway drifted toward sleep, grateful for every moment that had led him here, hopeful for all the moments still to come. In the main house, Catherine Ashworth set aside her book and turned off the reading lamp beside her chair. The music had ended, the night had grown deep, and it was time for rest. She thought about Marcus and his cottage, about the changes the past year had brought, about the way life has of surprising us with gifts we never knew we needed. She thought about Gerald, and for the first time in a very long while, the thought brought more joy than sorrow. He was with her still, in the letters she read each evening, in the greenhouse where his tomatoes grew, in every corner of the house they had shared. But he was not all there was. Life had continued, as it always does, and she had found new reasons to be glad of it. She rose and walked to the window, looking out at the dark grounds, at the cottage where a single light still burned, at the stars scattered across the sky like promises waiting to be kept. "Thank you," she whispered to the night, to the universe, to whatever force had brought Marcus Holloway to that highway at just the right moment on just the right night. "Thank you for sending him to me." The wind stirred the curtains gently, and Catherine smiled, then turned and made her way upstairs to bed. The house settled into silence, the old timbers creaking softly as they always did, a sound as familiar and comforting as a lullaby. Outside, the autumn night held its peace, the stars, wheeling slowly overhead, the world resting in the gentle arms of darkness. And at Winding Brook Manor, as in homes across Millbrook and beyond, the people who had found each other against all odds settled into sleep, their hearts at peace, their stories continuing to unfold in the gentle rhythm of days and nights, seasons and years, the endless tender turning of time toward healing, toward hope, toward home. Sleep now, dear listener. Let the peace of this story carry you down into rest. Let the warmth of unexpected kindness wrap around you like a soft blanket. Let the knowledge that grace finds us in our darkest moments settle into your heart. The night is gentle, the world is quiet, and you too are worthy of rest, of peace, of all the tender mercies that find us when we least expect them. Close your eyes now, breathe deeply, let go. Tomorrow will bring what it brings, but tonight there is only this moment, safe, warm, complete. Rest now. You are held. You are home. The end.